Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. Welcome to this roundtable. We will maybe give it for 1-2 minutes to make sure everybody that wants can connect and can join the meeting. We will start soon. If there is any issue, please let us know in terms of connection. Reach out to myself or Diana in case of need. But I see already all the speakers have connected, so that's great. Okay, given that we don't have too much time in this, I'm going to start the discussion and the meeting. So welcome again to the roundtable on Gen Z and protest, innovation and technology. We want to look at this issue from a human rights lens. Just also that you know, right now there is still an ongoing session at the plenary, so there might be some people that might be joining a little bit later. But anyway, we will proceed and have the discussion, and whoever is available and able to join is great. It's great to have you all here, and I also would like to introduce Diana, who will help me in moderating this. Maybe Diana, just at the outset, if you can explain the features of the online moderation.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. I don't know if you can see me on the screen. Yeah, because of some camera. Anyways, just for your information, if you have questions, please put them in the question and answer part of the meeting, and we will address them to the panel. Also, if you'd like to speak after the keynote interventions, please raise your hands. And we will give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is very much a hybrid panel. So of course, some of the speakers are online, some of the participants are online, others are in the room. So we will try to make it as fluid as possible. We chose this topic because, of course, there were a lot of discussions recently about the wave of Gen Z protests around the world. In, I think, every continent, there were some that had some more success, some less, and we wanted to look at it from a specific angle, which is the innovation and technology, given that it is the broader summit of this Rights Egg Summit that we are having today, and see if the new tools support or challenge those movements, if there is a change in the shift in the way that these civic movements are taking place and shape online, and what maybe are protections concerns, what might be new potential avenues for civic space movements online to leverage these new tools, and assess from a human rights lens in the end what are the main issues and concerns that we want to bring up. We will have some country examples in order not to make it too dry and to have some discussions on it. Before I proceed, I wanted to quickly introduce the panel. We will start out with Raghu, who is already on the screen, who is Raghu Menon, who is our desk officer in OHCHR on Nepal. He has himself worked before for the OHCHR office in Nepal, as well as has been recently in Nepal on to look into the protest movement and the transition that is ongoing. To let you know, unfortunately, Tashi Lassom, who was supposed to speak on Nepal, is not available, given that she has a high-level engagement with the transition government. This morning, they need to sign, there is a process on signing an MOU. So she was a very last-minute cancellation. Very sorry for that. I hope you can bear with me that there are sometimes these mishaps that happen. The next speaker that I would like to introduce is Yashika. Yashika is a master student in international development studies at the Geneva Graduate Institute, specializing in human rights and humanitarianism. He has worked with us in OHCHR and UNDP on AI and sustainable development and digital public infrastructure initiative. She focuses on the intersection of technology, human rights, and civic space, and is, of course, a representative of the Gen Z movement. So happy to have her. Then we will proceed to Adebayo Okeowo, who is from Witness. Maybe you have heard Witness already speaking at the plenary this morning. There was a very poignant keynote speech. Adebayo is a human rights lawyer with over a decade's experience on working around issues on socioeconomic rights, environment justice, international criminal accountability. He is focusing on exploring through research and practice the intersection between human rights and technology, so very well placed to address. Then we will move to Marcelo. Marcelo is a human rights officer in the OHCHR office, working on technology in civic space at OHCHR. He has 20 years of experience on human rights. He has researched and reported on the freedom of expression, privacy, covering issues such as the internet shutdown, surveillance, and data protection of critical voices in the digital sphere. So, with having said that, I would like to give the floor first to Raghu for his presentation, and then we will move on to the panel. At the end of their presentations, there will be an interaction between you and the panelists in terms of questions and answers. Thank you very much. Over to you, Raghu.
Thanks, Marlene. I hope you can hear me. I was having some famously tech glitch in this online era, so glad to have joined. Apologies for the very holiday-esque t-shirt I'm wearing as well. I wasn't planning to join this, and also apologies for not being in the Gen Z bracket. But I'm glad I could join. As you said, Tashi could not join. She sends her apologies. She was just trying to message me as well. I think it's an incredible, space and time that they are in at this moment, having somehow been left in the middle or found themselves in the middle of this historic change and still grappling with the realities of what that means for the nation, for the people, etc. I think Nepal, as we all know, and I think we've read various elements of it, the Gen Z protests in Nepal in September was a unique experience in terms of how it unfolded. Obviously, there are similarities with other mass movements that have happened in Nepal. As some of us in the OHCHR office as well who worked in the country and are aware of the history. Unfortunately, Nepal has found itself in such a situation several times in the past. Every 10 years, they famously say that there has been famous, mass movements. And the key difference has been, I guess, in a way, technology, and in a way, maybe how technology and the online space amalgamates and mobilizes people. Because whereas the 1990s protests for the mass movement, was spread over months for bringing multi-party democracy, 2006, the end of the monarchy's absolute rule at the fag end of the armed conflict, was also spread over weeks, down from months a decade before. And then we had September 8th and 9th, which was shortened to less than 24 hours in terms of how these changes were precipitated on the ground. I think that the key enabler there was the sort of the medium and how that medium helps bring people together. And when I use technology here, I'm into using it with online space, civic space. So please bear with me on that. I think what we've seen in Nepal is about how the online space, the tech platform was at the center of the genesis of this movement and also how it catalyzed the movement. Weeks, months ahead of the protests on the 8th and 9th, this was the space where youngsters were sharing their frustrations about, cost of living crisis, about supposed inequalities, about opportunities, about corruption in public life, and how that affects their everyday life. And so there was a conversation. It was sort of like the incubator of these frustrations with the system, with the people, with sometimes traditional civil society, with political parties. Then, when the government called for sort of gave an ultimatum to the tech companies to sign up or register locally and set a deadline and created and announced a social media ban. That was the final trigger, which then again brought them back to the online space where the protests were organized. There were also, I think, offline elements of this online sort of a movement. A lot of Gen Z protesters told me about how on the day of the protest there were so many young people and first time protesters, first time hitting the streets for for a, let's say supposedly political, for a human right issue. There were one of the things that they had to focus on, how to help them with the do's and don'ts of being in a public demonstration. What are the signs to watch out for, what are your rights, how to be safe. And I think unfortunately, that the way it played out, I think it weighs on them very heavy, but no one was expecting that kind of trigger and violence that happened. uh, I think tech and online space has also evolved in a way that I think no one expected. When we, famously now see how the next interim government and particularly the interim prime minister was sort of chosen by a very unscientific poll on Discord and other online tech platforms where there were discussions. And these are all very real-time discussions because there was a group of Gen Z leaders who had been invited by the army and the president to try and discuss the transition, but also people who were involved because this was sort of a leaderless movement who were involved with these discussions. They wanted to weigh in and bring in their peers on what do we want to see in the next government, not just in terms of representation, but also in terms of issues, the kind of cabinet that needs to be chosen, the optics of it, about how they perhaps did not want people with a political background to be in this interim government, and that sort of shaped the idea of the interim government, and in many ways shapes the idea of who the prime minister, the interim prime minister, tried to include into her into her cabinet. Um, I think we continue to see how the space is evolving in terms of I think the schism between the traditional civil society, for instance, let's call it that, the people who've been existing in that online space, that civic space, who have been at the forefront of many democratic and human rights movements in a country like Nepal, and this young crop which has created its own civic space, and it is another civil society unto itself. There's mistrust between them. There is a lack of bridge between them. I think the way they perceive civic action, what they demand, the speed at which they demand changes, also I think is something that we notice that has changed. Tech is at the center of the current mobilization that is happening. I think one of the very interesting things is that this next general election that are supposed to happen by the 5th of March was also probably the first time where many young voters, first time voters or voters who previously were not particularly involved in the electoral franchise experience, they have been mobilized to register to vote, because these votes will mean, their voting and their participation is going to be key to decide who forms the government next time, and how does this sentiment actually play out at the at the ballot box, and how does it translate into sort of democratic processes. And this has been a very successful process of trying to bring more and more young people particularly to register to vote for the next elections. Unfortunately, there are also realities of tech that we are aware about, how while these conversations and the organization can be very fluid, it can also take turns that perhaps are not very human rights friendly. And tech, again, and the online space has been, and because online space is not owned by just the progressive voices, has been at the center of mis and disinformation campaigns that are rife in Nepal right now, including those targeting people, from historically marginalized communities, including some prominent Gen Z leaders who hail from such communities. But I think there is, for me, what was also interesting was the other side of it, which was tech again, the online space again, was also the space where people, especially young Gen Z leaders from these minority backgrounds, were the ones who used that space to push back on, the democratic backsliding that was possibly going to happen, especially on constitutional guarantees of inclusion, anti-discrimination, opportunities, fundamental rights. So I think that is a very dynamic space where there is some, push back and forth. Um, I think what is very instrumental, or what is very, I think, interesting to note is that you mentioned this memorandum of understanding that the Gen Z leaders are trying to sign with the government in a way to institutionalize this movement so that this movement is seen as a key political marker in Nepal's modern history. And very interestingly, one of the pieces that they have mentioned there is what they call preserving the digital medium used by the Nepali people as valid civic space, and I'm quoting here, and recognizing the new digital medium, cultural symbols, and creative expressions used by the movement participants and the youth during the People's Movement of September, and how that can be used to start discussion and also to resolve key issues. The issues that are at the heart of this or at the heart of this process are not so different from what maybe the office or OHR, the UN, others have called the root causes of the armed conflict. But they're probably seen in a slightly different light. Whereas the traditional civil society maybe and political actors talked about inequality, discrimination, corruption. Gen Zs sort of boil that down to issues like Nepo kids. The root cause of it was not very different because these issues have unfortunately plagued Nepal for a fairly long time. And I think the medium in which these concerns were expressed and the mediums in which people were mobilized was slightly different. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting introduction. And I will straight hand over to Yashika for her presentation. Thanks.
Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And I also want to extend my sincere thanks to the Innovation Hub and the Early Warning Unit for inviting me to share a Gen Z perspective on emerging technologies and what it will mean for early warning systems of foresight, more or less. So, a quick disclaimer before I begin. The views I share today are my own and they don't represent any institution I've worked with, and I don't speak for all of Gen Z. But I hope some of these reflections resonate with you, both here in room and those who have joined us online. So, as we all know, technology today is woven into nearly every aspect of our lives. It is no longer a phenomenon limited to any one generation, whether it is messaging platforms or social media networks that shape much of our daily information flow. Technology has become central to the way we communicate. At a structural level, it now underpins sectors as diverse as trade, education, governance, electoral processes, and even judiciary. Yet, while we celebrate these advancements, particularly with the rise of artificial intelligence, we must not lose sight of critical questions. Questions about ethics and about how technology is being deployed and sold, about privacy, consent, data protection. These questions matter and they are at the heart of what many young people, including Gen Z, are raising around the world. Emerging technologies, especially AI, have tremendous potential. In early warning systems, for example, AI allows us to analyze information at a scale and speed that was unimaginable even a decade ago. During Geneva Peace Week that I attended, I saw a session by Principles for Peace. It's an organization, and they were talking about their Peace Navigator initiative, where AI is being used to build contextual understanding of countries before mediators enter a conflict space. So, information can now travel from one corner of the world to another in seconds. Personally, as someone living away from India, I rely heavily on social media to stay informed about what is unfolding back home. In disaster risk reduction, technology has strengthened two-way communication, allowing organizations to reach affected populations and allowing communities to reach decision makers at a scale that was not possible before. And we saw this during the 2023 Syria Turkey earthquake, where people used social media and mobile platforms to share real-time locations and request rescue, inform emergency responders. And mind you, it was largely the young population who drove these efforts using their technological skills and online networks to support and amplify the response. In judicial sector too, innovation is underway. So for my thesis, I am studying online dispute resolution in India. And during that, I also came across the AI initiatives that the judiciary is taking to explore using AI in tasks such as documentation, review, and translation. So technology is also transforming political participation. The recent New York mayoral election showed how digital outreach and online organizing can mobilize audiences who may not have been reached through traditional campaigning. For Gen Z, social media is not merely entertainment. It is a tool to organize, to question power, to build solidarity, to understand diverse perspectives, to stand against injustice, including genocide. And yes, even to vote on Discord when the need arises. For many of us, technology is not about trends. It's about agency, about using digital spaces to stand up for what we believe in. But in moving fast, we must ask ourselves, what are we leaving behind? Do we overlook consent? Do we ignore data breaches and biases, some of which may reproduce the same historical imbalances and colonial legacies we aim to dismantle? Do we widen the digital divide and the even wider AI divide when policies assume equal access? Do online spaces make it easier for people to defame and demean, hiding behind faceless identities with little accountability for their actions? Do we cross ethical boundaries in the name of early warning by monitoring private digital spaces? Do we forget that building the infrastructure powering AI, yes, the very physical infrastructure like data centers and computational facilities, also have environmental and human rights implications? If the answer to any of these is a yes, then it is time to shift the conversation. It is time to discuss safeguards. It is time to address the ethical implications of generative AI. It is time to build systems that are not only technologically advanced but people centered. And it is time to recognize that Gen Z must be included not only as beneficiaries or observers, but as stakeholders, innovators, and contributors to the future we are shaping. Maybe the moment has come for us not to leave these conversations behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yashika. I really appreciated the provocative questions, and I hope we can start to find some answers soon to this. I think it was a great segue to Adebayo for his presentation, which links and is a first answer maybe on some of those questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's good to be in conversation with everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. And for those joining online as well, thank you for being a part of this. I wish I could be there in the hall in Geneva. I've been to Geneva a couple of times, and this would have been another good opportunity to do that. Apologies, I couldn't make it. But thanks for creating this conversation. A huge thanks to the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. I think it's a very, very topical, very relevant conversation we're having, that it begs both reflection and solution providing, and I hope that within the conversation we have, we could get to that. In the short while, I would share my perspectives from the work that we have been doing at Witness. with activists at the front lines. And for those who do not know, Witness is a human rights organization that works on the issues of human rights and technology. And we've been in existence for over 30 years, since 1992. And we were started at the point in time when social media was not a thing. Cell phones were not even a thing. And we were created to address an issue where it felt necessary to expose injustice using technology. Technology at the time, meaning your handycams, your Sony handycams, or some other camcorders that people had at the time. What we believed at that moment was it was going to be important that the more people that could document and expose atrocities, the more chances would have at arriving at justice and accountability. And I'll take us a bit back before 1992, when Witness was founded, to share with us some perspective about how the notion of human rights fact-finding itself has evolved. I mean, people are sitting in the UN office there, and this would resonate with a number of folks. If you think about how this started, human rights fact-finding was the job of the UN officers many years ago, when at the early stages of this, where the officials were the ones who were credible, who had the ability to go into regions where there had been conflict and carry out investigations and make determinations and issue reports. Those reports would be deliberated on, and then conclusions would be made and decisions would be arrived at to see how to adjust the challenges facing that particular region. Then that would be the first generation of maybe human rights fact-finding. And then you go on to the second generation of human rights fact-finding, which would be more around your international organizations, your Amnesty International and the likes, maybe around in the 1970s, thereabout, where they also had, very credible, reputable officials who would, again, pretty much similar to the UN model at the time, go into conflict zones, have to investigate, speak to witnesses, and then come back with their reports and be able to advocate for change. Then fast forward a little bit, we started having a third generation, which you would call your citizen journalists. And that generation, I think, has now continued to be more equipped and empowered. That's a generation that would now be armed with their cell phones, mobile cameras, and at the spot of a moment can document a violation and expose it to the world in order to both gain attention, but also drive for change. And that ability to do that spontaneously introduced both opportunities and also some challenges, and as we've continued to see the evolution since those years, now to this era where we have artificial intelligence, there are so many opportunities, but at the same time, many challenges. And when we think about technology itself, which both Raghu has mentioned, I feel this is very important to know that the technology that's available to the activists is also available to other bad actors. And also in many other cases, governments that are being oppressive, the governments that have been faced with the protests across the world, the Gen Z protests, those governments that have had to confront the dissatisfaction from their citizens. And while dissatisfaction from citizens is not a new thing, it has become unacceptable for many activists and young people who feel there has to be a change so that they could live a better, more wholesome life. The challenge, though, is that the technology that is being leveraged by activists and those at the front lines is also the same technology that is available to the government. And I'll give you some few examples. So, for instance, if we're familiar with what happened in 2020, that is not related to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were a number of other protests in 2020. One of it was the George Floyd protest in the US. That was quite significant. And there was also the protests in Nigeria called the End SARS protest, SARS standing for Special Anti-Robbery Squad. And I would give a quote from one of the protesters at the time, who on the night of 20th of October had to say, said this was the motivation for why she was documenting. And her form of documentation at that time was actually to live stream police brutality. And when she was asked why did she risk everything to document in that moment, here is what she said. She said, "So let's make sure the world sees this so they don't change the story and tell people that we killed ourselves. I didn't want us to die in vain. This is somebody that goes by the name Catherine Obianuju, and she live streamed police brutality on the streets of Lagos on the night of 20th of October 2020 and broadcast it to millions of people watching across the world, triggering an immediate reaction from a lot of people who demanded that there should be change and accountability. And that indeed triggered an investigation, triggered accountability methods and processes, which was really important. But at the same time, because she leveraged the same technology, the government used the same technology to oppress and to suppress some of these voices. And that is where the conflict begins to happen, where the power of technology allows people to mobilize, to engage, and to hold power to account. But if we do not address the issue of poor governance and bad leadership, that same technology could be weaponized against those who are seeking change in their governments. And so for the case of Catherine Obianuju, for instance, she has had to leave the country because there was suppression and then the government was out to arrest her, and so many other activists as well that were involved in those protests. And I would say that this goes even further than what the government should take responsibility for. We have other tactics that are being used by government to suppress freedom of expression. And we've seen this even in the context of the recent Gen Z protest. So we find them resorting to the banning of apps. I think that was also already mentioned. Even in the case of Nepal, there were about 20-something social media apps that were banned, including the Discord that was initially banned, and then people circumvented that using VPNs and so on and so forth to still be able to mobilize and to engage. And these are questions we need to ask ourselves: is what responsibility do tech platforms also hold when it comes to being authorized or being demanded to approve a ban of their platforms if it is not on justifiable grounds? That in itself needs to be questioned. And we've seen some pushback in some countries whereby when there's a ban being issued by a government, that is challenged in the court of law, so as to be able to say, you know what, if we do not have legitimate grounds for why this should be banned, then we would not oblige. That is what we want to see more of, and platforms and tech companies should be able to take that position and not be always aligning with what they might consider more of a business decision. Because when it comes to human rights, I think that should be a shared responsibility. But even beyond what the governments demand of themselves, the tech companies have made some wrong calls in certain instances, whereby due to their regulation of what is on their platforms, they have taken down very critical evidence of human rights abuses. And that in itself impedes the ability of this movement to be able to demand and push for change. And so you've seen in cases whereby there's a mislabeling of authentic footage as being false footage. And that also did happen in some of the protests previously, where platforms like Instagram labeled authentic footage and called it false, only to retract that some hours later and apologize for that error. But those errors are significant because they then go on to delegitimize the trustworthiness of that content by those who are risking everything to push out the truth and get justice and accountability. And I think the last thing I would name here is the evolution of AI and synthetic media. And that in itself has created both the opportunity for protesters to, for instance, anonymize themselves because they are facing severe risks when they try to expose injustice. But at the same time, we find that the ability to anonymize is also being reverse engineered by governments who also de-anonymize individuals. And so this is a broader conversation. And what we've discovered in the work we've done is there are a number of tactics that are being taken by those at the front lines. Opportunities should be created for a cross-fertilization of those ideas, from Nepal to Kenya, from Kenya to Bangladesh, from Bangladesh to Nigeria, and other places where these protests have happened, where there would be the need to exchange notes. And I think platforms like this also allow for us to do that, so as to ensure that people are able to deploy tactics that are efficient and are effective in both advancing their cause, but also keeping them safe in the face of tyranny. I would end there, and then maybe could ask if there are questions at the later time to speak more to those at that session.
Thanks a lot. And yeah, let's hear how to face from Marcelo. And over to you.
Thank you so much. Very, very glad to be here. I'll kind of go through the different presentations as I think they very well connect with each other. I think the first key idea we have to bear in mind, I mean, when we discuss the Gen Z protests and their relevance, is that, I mean, of course, protests are civic space in motion. They are an inherent part of every social movement, and they are present across, history in different geographies, and as such, they are also recognized as a fundamental freedom. They are part of human rights, and there is a clear recognition that they will reappear everywhere. People would naturally find ways of expressing their views jointly, and the ways that this right to be exercised, of course, is a powerful indicator on probabilities of worsening conditions, and of course the levels of violence, and how somehow the attempts to suppress the voices are in place in a certain context, with consequences in the short and the long run. The second point, I think it's common, and is that, of course, across history, we'll see youth and young people as being a major critical actor in different contexts. We speak now about Gen Z, but if we would go through history of political movements and social movements, we would find students, young leaders, as the catalysts of these processes. And we'll find also, as and I'll go soon to my next point, as communications changed, cross-fertilization among movements. Students in 68, starting in Italy, Poland, and US, Paris, Prague, there is a dynamic exchange between these youth movements, as also communication changes and these networks become possible. And of course, another element is that youth groups are always revisiting language, transforming language. They are the first to appropriate the new mediums and then use them to challenge not just the existing order or to express discontent with several of the constraints they face, but also challenge language, create new symbols, reorganize language itself, and by that challenge power. And then, if we look also in the history of protests, and we'll see how also the medium, the changes with technology, we're also going to be shaping and informing how protests, in a way, can happen and unfold from the printing, from the dissemination of printing to the ability to produce posters. There's some interesting work on the history of protests that are like, I will see at every different movement, you see how, for example, the development of the copy machine and the expansion of that, all the leaflets, how they became then an essential mechanism to mobilize. Then you have, of course, radio, and radio was a very important way of crossing across boundaries. Community radios and even cassette tapes were used, like in the resistance movements in the 70s, to share messages and then mobilize. And then we come to the digital transformation. And of course, I think it comes to everyone's mind what happened, especially with Arab Spring, and how there was a certain euphoria there in terms of how much technology was enabling and creating new spaces, as it actually, like, social media was very instrumental. And then what we see is that, of course, as well described before, as this technology evolves, so will evolve and the appropriation of technology by these different movements. So will also evolve the ways that different authorities are going to try to monitor and then interfere with these tools. If we look at, I think, the most recent protest events, what we see as key elements that were shared, we have the ability to live stream as being a very critical point, the instant videos. We have, of course, the hashtags, the memes that have enabled, as Raghu was describing, how from in a very quick space of time, the message gets across and the mobilization happens. We have, of course, the use of encrypted channels and that as an alternative for communications then to be channeled as restrictions and limitations start to emerge in the more traditional social media. So then, of course, Discord, for example, becomes a more important space for dialogue because other platforms are not seen as safe or possible for protesters to use. And we have crowdfunding also as another important strategy that emerges with technology. But then comes what has changed and then what has not changed. I think it's important to also recognize as we try to, as we discuss, let's say, the prospects of protests evolution in these recent trends, that a few patterns remain the same. With or without the benefit of digital tools, of course, the key indicators on what is actually happening on the ground is the prevalence of violence. We found in these protesters over this year also, police repression, killings, injuries, the criminalization of protests, the attempts to ban, and of course, repression of journalistic coverage. But we also find new forms, and then that's, I think, what we've been. I think it's important to think in strategic terms as how new forms of interference are going to emerge as authorities try to also take advantage of the digital tools in a way to monitor and then suppress some of these protests. And then I would say there are a few areas where we have and many others have reported consistently in terms of concerns. Of course, we'll have the issue with shutdowns because the digital tool becomes such a central element for that. It will be a very quick and immediate response to that. And shutdowns have evolved from the massive shutdowns that we had in Cairo in the Arab Spring to much more hidden and different ways of throttling and disrupting communications without being perceived. And shutdowns, of course, with always, very problematic and widespread impact in economy, society. So governments have also tried to, in a way, refrain from these mass shutdowns because of the huge impact it had, and also how easy with the development of new tools to somehow bypass the control of the shutdown. So that's one point. The second point, I think, it's surveillance. Of course, as we all described here, digital technologies enable much more the control of communications and the control of movement. And you have, of course, the marketing of tools and the refinement of tools of facial recognition to monitor protests. You have the issue of different and evolving technology surveillance market of malware that are going to be used to penetrate, for example, encrypted channels or to try to extract information before or during protests. And then another element, which is, I think, challenging, and it relates to the AI discussion, is that of course, state actors are going to, or other actors connected with those working to dismantle protests is not always just the state. You have the infiltration in these different protest, different networks, let's say, of civil society gathering to try to, for example, disrupt, or of course information campaigns which are going to be conducted in a way to promote different messaging or disrupt the protest, or even mislead protesters and expose them to risk. So 4 points on what to do, or like what are key areas for, I think, us to take action here. Again, connecting with what was discussed. I think first, keep listening and learning, because of course, as said, as language changes, as protest changes, we need also to refine our monitoring tools. We need to refine our understanding, and there's a lot to learn with every wave of mobilization. Second point is mitigate the risks, that these new risks. So really talking about shutdowns, talking about surveillance, providing tools for civil society to operate safely or bypass all these barriers is another critical element, because we know they are going to appear. Third point is relating to also what was just presented, is improving documentation. We have to keep collecting evidence. We have to work to preserve that evidence, as was just described. There is also the risk of losing some of these, either because of the ways companies or states are going to interfere there, and make full advantage of the tools we have. And we have issues, of course, with AI and the different allegations of authenticity and the issues with trust there. And finally, of course, support each other, as I think we all saw through these movements. They learn with each other, and then there's no other way around. So yeah, these would be my 4 points. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That concludes different presentations. Now you can start thinking about the questions. For me, one thing that came up very much is maybe the particularity of the Gen Z is like this cross-fertilization. So that something that's happening in one place might inspire somebody else at the other end of the globe. I think maybe 50 years ago, that was not yet so much connected. However, we also have heard there's a lot of, it has been there. Let's not pretend it's new that young people are protesting. It's something that has been there over hundreds of years, and it's a normal occurrence. I think we should not be, just because it's a new name, be all surprised. Again, maybe the tools that are there are different, but also, as Marcelo has just pointed out, there have been with every innovation that came before, like the printing press, like the cameras. There has been a change and a shift, and it's obvious that leaders of protests and civic space are using those tools, as are the governments, of course, to control them. So it's also a bit of this cat and mouse game. Yeah. Then I really liked also the question that was raised by Yashika about the digital divide. Are we actually, by using these tools in the civic space movement, does it mean it is exclusive to a specific group in a society to access those and to use those tools, and is leaving behind and maybe parts of a society that is not able to function online, that doesn't have a connected mobile phone, that is not engaging? So are we kind of shifting in different realities? So these are some of the thoughts that were in my mind, but yeah, I open the floor to anyone who has questions. I see there are some online that you can divert to if there's in the room. Is there any question right now that you would like to ask? Yes, Rory.
So my name's Rory. I work on the Asia Pacific region. So with Raghu, we've had this experience in Nepal and, of course, Bangladesh last year. I mean, I found all of the insights really, really relevant, and thank you especially for the questions you posed. I think one question in my mind, just as a takeaway from these more recent experiences, is the difference between mobilization and organization. The technology is hyper accelerating the organization. And I mean, these examples given, show that.
Yeah.
But what happens in terms of organization to sustain that movement? And I remember years ago, actually, I mean, I must go back to it, but I remember reading a thing that, what's his name, Malcolm Gladwell, or, he wrote a piece, I remember, in the New Yorker, and it was a comparison between the Green Revolution in Iran and the civil rights movement in the US, and the way in which the civil rights movement had built itself up through this process of organization in church basements and community halls and the structures and the cells and everything else that had sort of sustained that movement's success, compared to a social media driven movement that had not been able to sustain itself in the face of repression. And I just remember that analysis, and I sort of think about it in relation to these recent experiences. So we have Nepal with all of the promise, but the political parties are sitting there waiting, and they are out-organized, over-organized in terms of, I mean, even co-opting now the student Gen Z leadership. Bangladesh, the students have formed a political party. We'll see how that goes. I mean, it's certainly going to be a new element in the political equation there, which is a good thing. But equally, through that process of party formation, they also become a bit corrupted and a bit compromised and, politicized as well. So yeah, just this question of organization. How do you accompany mobilization with organization? I think is a really important dimension of this. I don't have an answer, but I think when you look at the movements of the past that have succeeded, they've had that stronger organizational element behind them.
Thanks a lot, Rory. I see that there's one question, Diana, maybe you want to, in the chat, that was interesting one also.
Yes, thank you. The question was, and I think it was partially addressed by Marcelo, but it's a very good, interesting point that is being raised. So it's about the intersection of innovation tech and civic space democracy. The person is asking, is Christina. She's asking how to have tech innovations which have scalability and financial resilience. So we need support models and investment models for civil society. And she would like to hear from the panelists how do they see this matter. The issue of needing of funding mechanisms that makes difficult, and what kind of support models and investment models for civil societies exist and can be available for the protesters and for the human rights defenders.
A third question? Yeah, thank you.
I'll maybe just add on and continue to Rory's, if I'm right, question. Well, he talked about how these mobilizations do not sustain after we can say revolution has happened. And I was wondering while hearing from Marcelo as well as to how youth have been at the center of protest throughout history, and they have been active organizers of these movements. Wherever you see, especially in the anti-colonial movements, we know we celebrate Gandhi and Nehru from India to our anti-colonial movement. But even there on the ground, there were huge numbers of youth that were actively protesting, fighting the colonial government. But yet again, every time there is this circle that we see that whenever these protests sort of end or these revolutions sort of end, the power and the agency again somehow comes back to the so-called experienced or landed elite. And that has been the result of French Revolution or the American Revolution or the anti-colonial movements in the global South, or even now the revolution that have been seen. Well, when the youth are at the center of these protest movements, why do we see such a large disparity, and what are the fault lines where there is huge participation of youth in these protests, but minimal participation of youth then in the formation of parliaments or in big houses like the UN?
Hmm.
What are the fault lines apart from, say, organization?
Thanks a lot. I see some coherence. Yes,
Already.
yes, please.
Hello, I'm Olivia Kobe from OMCT, the World Organization Against Torture. And I really love that Adebayo brought up the question of responsibility and accountability for online platforms, from tech companies and maybe states. And I was wondering if you were aware of any attempt to hold the online platforms or states accountable for the bans and because we know that states in Africa, for example, like in Cameroon or in Tanzania, in Togo, in many countries this year, we witnessed imposed bans on social media and internet, and it's really difficult for Gen Z to mobilize and organize and everything. So yeah, I was wondering like what are the cases of litigation that have been tried? Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we turn to the back to the panel and we try to answer and have some of those questions, comments, and then we can go to a second round of questions if we still have time. Don't hesitate to also publish it online chat, so we will follow that as well. Maybe we start first online and then we go to the room panel. So I think Adebayo, the last question was very much also addressed to your comment. So if you have a response or also to others, let's start with you, just because you're on the screen.
Well, that's the thing now. I didn't even know I was right down the screen because everybody's apparently seeing my face right there in the center. But yes, so I can start. Good questions all around and really great hearing my other co-panelists share. To the last question, I'll start with that. You're right that there have been a number of internet shutdowns and bans that have occurred in many African countries and outside of Africa as well. Sometimes it's actually very uncreative of governments to resort to the same tactics, to be honest, because and I'm not giving them tips here in case governments are listening. I'm not giving them tips for them to start getting creative. But it's just the same method of operation every single time as a way of curtailing freedom of expression that they would go and resort to bans and internet shutdowns. We've found how people have circumnavigated that. I remember when the protests in Nigeria as well hit a very high ceiling, the government banned Twitter. And what seemed like was going to be a short ban, which was already going to was already shocking, ended up being an 11-month ban on Twitter. It took people, civil society, to take that case to court, the ECOWAS court, that's the regional bloc, to ensure that the government was found unlawful in its action by restricting access to Twitter. So that was successful. The ECOWAS court held the Nigerian government in breach of the freedom of expression by banning Twitter, which was good. But of course, that took 11 months, right? Prior to that, what people started to do was to use VPNs to circumvent the ban. When governments saw that they were using VPNs, they then threatened and said that anybody who was using VPNs to access Twitter was going to be prosecuted. And at that point, it did impact some people's ability to show up, but some people chose nonetheless to break the odds that whatever happened, they were going to get prosecuted. And I'm saying all of this to say that sometimes there are no easy answers, no easy way out. While there would be the existence of that, I think a lot more needs to be done from global bodies, to ensure that governments are held accountable. Courts will take their time, and I've seen it effective, not just even the Nigerian case. There have been other ways that people have approached this, and one of it is by taking the telecoms themselves to court, and that seems a bit more doable because telecoms have a lot more at stake. Governments can sometimes be very challenging and difficult, but a telecoms company was taken to court in, I believe, was it Lesotho now, and was issued a restraining order from complying with the government's order to impose a ban or to throttle the internet on those who are using their services. So that was a very successful case. And maybe that is something to explore every now and again as a strategy to at least bypassing or preventing those limitations. Another thing that we have proposed as witness is how people could document even though there's an internet shutdown. So in the moment when there is still an existing shutdown and people are still not able to expose the truth, we still have guidance on how people should document in those moments so that when the internet does get restored, there could still be an exposure of the atrocities and there could be a push for justice and accountability. I hope that, I mean, those are some of the strategies that at least we're trying to advise on, but at least the combination of that hopefully would get people some answers. And then I think one of the other questions I would just quickly touch on was the one about the organization and mobilization. I think somebody asked or made a comment about that. And it is true, the strength of some of the recent protests are both also their weakness. So you have almost like a decentralized kind of system where there is no leader per se. It's mobilized online and people are able to, because of that, galvanize and everybody just coalesces around a shared vision. That is the strength, because it also makes it difficult for the governments to shut down the movement. And we've seen this many times. When they do not have a leader in particular that they could go to say, hey, let's get you into a room and let's have a conversation, it makes it harder for them to quickly shut it down. And so they don't even attempt to do that. But at the same time, that becomes like the Achilles heel of some of the movements, because people sometimes need to galvanize around a structure. And so something that we are always also encouraging is, I think it's a good strategy to have it decentralized, but then there should be the sort of what you call the pillars, other people who are able to support such movements. And that would be civil society, really, not centering themselves, but supporting from the back end. Like civil societies should continue to center those who are doing this work and giving them the wraparound structure and support. And that would sometimes mean, defending them in court, providing legal advice, providing them with funds as well, because they're not as structured. They can also apply for the source of funds that would be able to sustain them and so on and so forth. So CSOs should really continue to think of how they could center some of those movements. That way they would be able to have a more lasting impact beyond that moment when they were pushing for change.
Thanks a lot. Raghu, do you want to comment on some of the questions, comments?
Yes, thanks, Marlene. No, there were some interesting questions and, also interesting to hear some other perspectives from the other panelists. I think, yeah, just, on continuing from what Adebayo was talking about, and also the issue of organization and mobilization. I think this is from the Nepali perspective, the Nepali context rather, is a very interesting challenge. And I'll club that with what just club my sort of response or my observations rather with the other question that another person raised in the room about participation of the youth in the post revolution uprising context, and also the question on the funding, just from the Nepali context. These are things that are very relevant, at least in the Nepali context. These are being discussed. I think it's interesting, and I asked many of the Gen Z leaders about, because what is interesting in Nepal is that many of the prominent voices who were around, who sort of emerged after the the protests or were around the organization of the protests and the movement and the response, many of them, or at least a large majority of them, are going to jump into the electoral fray. So they're all going the political route. They want to run for elections. They want to be public representatives, which is interesting because the youth, not necessarily all of them Gen Z, but fairly young people want to be part of elections and public life, which is a healthy thing for any democracy. But my question for them was, what happens to this online civic space that they have created? Who inherits this, or who continues to hold the space? Because in Nepal, it almost seems that if all the prominent voices and organized groups go towards politics, then it will be suddenly we will, the outsiders will be looking again at the traditional civil society to be taking the lead at creating that civic space that holds everyone in power or in public life to account, including the Gen Z leaders. Um, does that also mean that perhaps the question is whether there is a new sort of civic space that is opening up, not necessarily your professional or lifelong activists who are going to be leading voices in these spaces, whether it's going to be young people, professionals, others, farmers, etc., who sort of, it becomes a bit more fluid space in terms of being the fourth pillar or the fifth pillar of a democracy. I think the issue of representation is very important. I think the fault lines, as someone was saying, is not just in age, but of the fault lines also remain very much in the socio-political realities of the societies that these discussions or these issues are happening. For instance, in Nepal, the digital divide is not just urban and rural. The power divide and the digital divide is also perhaps between the established social hierarchies, whether it is class, caste, ethnicity, political background, and these issues play out even in the way the prominent Gen Z voices were fashioning or were designing the discussion and prioritizing the discussion. And this is why while it was encouraging to see that Gen Z leaders, voices from marginalized groups, historically marginalized groups, were pushing back to maintain that space and to ask questions of the Gen Z as well. But it's quite clear that those fault lines exist in those lines as well. I mean, it'll be interesting to see the Nepali context, how does this sentiment that we saw 3 months ago, how does this translate into, the democratic processes? Because ultimately, at least till now, this is how countries are deciding their fate in terms of which political direction should one sort of veer towards. Does this online space, this mobilization, does this actually translate into votes? And Nepal would be a particularly interesting context because I think 40% of the seats in the lower house of parliament are through proportional representation. So, which is where a lot of the young people are likely to get votes. But bear in mind, one of the reasons why, unlike what Rory said, unlike in Bangladesh, where there is a youth party that emerged because it was the student movement that translated into a political party, in Nepal, there hasn't been a Gen Z owned or Gen Z party or party that emerged from this movement. And when I asked people the question, Gen Z leaders, their answer was, just because we are of the same age bracket does not mean we have the same ideologies. And these are the realities and these are the discussions that are happening. Can they influence politics in other parties? Can they be a disruptor in the mainstream parties where Gen Z or at least younger voices and leaders emerge and break the mold? That's to be seen. I think the last bit I want to say is about the difference between the traditional, the sort of schism between the traditional and the gap between the traditional and the sort of Gen Z groups, traditional society and the Gen Z groups, is that I think the issue of funding is, already was such a major and resources was such a major issue because because the funding crisis that we are seeing across the globe, I think this is particularly hitting in the Nepali context, where people are looking to find ways of staying relevant, but also providing and continuing the services they do. But this crisis that has come along with the sort of Gen Z protests that has suddenly left them vulnerable in terms of, or actually scratching their heads in terms of how do they, innovate, but also how do they continue to remain relevant in this discussion where Gen Z voices are leading, but traditional civil society does not have the resources to continue their work. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Maybe Marcelo, Yashiko, or Yashika first? Yashika first.
Interesting topic for the questions we had. So I think you brief opinions on all the questions together. And I would like to start with one interesting trend that is happening recently, and I saw research about it too. It's around this posting zero trend. It's going on Instagram. So basically, I will not say Gen Z, but younger generations, they are more reluctant to post now because there is this fear or this attitude of constantly being under surveillance. And here is the question about governance that comes in, that the fellow panelists were talking about. Because if we think that there is the same technology is being used by the other side to keep a constant like watch on what we are doing, then it becomes a threat, not for like what we are standing up against or like the organization we are in, but also your personal careers, personal spaces. And then that's why it's like that's why mobilization can be seen like at a larger scale, but organization is still very less, because politics or how people organize and fight for some causes, it's seen as something which is not very like something that people would want to do like for a longer period of time. I can only I particularly agree with Raghu here that it's a very contextual understanding of every situation when we talk about organization and mobilization per se. Because for India, for instance, we don't have one party which is like just Gen Z, but since the demography of the country is such that younger population is larger in number, then you'll see like more people in the from universities and under these student organization banners coming forward and protesting. But does this like survive? Not really, because of how the governance in power is taking place. And that's why you will not see many people like, I mean, at least for me personally, I'll be very scared to just outrightly pinpoint people who are in power, because I have a career to make, right? So it's like, I think here the issue is governance for sure, and how they portray younger people and what they are doing, because the problems are the same, but how they are portraying it or what mechanisms they're using, that is the difference. So we need to really talk about these safeguard issues and ethics issues. And the other thing on funding is also related to this, because um, if you want these organizations to survive, and if you want that they mobilize themselves and they have some relevance, it is very essential that at least not only governments, but if civil society can have their backs. And basically funding as such gives push to every sector to move forward and to put their points forth, not just in a country specific situation, but also internationally. So you gain more relevance and hence you gain more power. And maybe then you can speak about things because you trust that what you're saying is something which is relevant and people are there to support you. I think that is the point I wanted to make.
Thanks a lot.
So thank you. Many points. I'll not take a long time because I mean I just basically agree with what was described. Just reinforcing what was shared by Abedayo on shutdowns. I mean there is a lot that can and must be done to, for example, hold companies also to account or to make them to take action. And there's the need to exchange information around that. We did a report on the impact of shutdowns in 2022, and we have some materials also online on shutdowns, some short materials. And this is an area where I believe that organized civil society work documenting shutdowns, for example, through the Keep It On campaigns and sharing data has improved our ability to, for example, detect variation of communication latency and the probability of something happening has improved our capacity to challenge that. Of course, states and companies somehow there are different ways that these are made hidden through orders that also oblige the company not to disclose information and so on. And there's been challenges on that. And I think even the Nigeria case, for example, these are very paradigmatic examples on the challenges we have also to deal with this in the existing speed of justice systems, and where, like, for you to then have a response, it's already long time gone, and the impact of these disruptions is already happen, and widespread effect is already there. And on the other point other points in general relation to the future of movements and how these different groups somehow materializing transformation. We're talking here, when we're talking about, as was said, mobilization and organization, we're talking about freedom of assembly and then freedom of association, and now the different forms of representation are there transformed into stable organizations, being them unions, political parties or civil society organizations, and all the constraints that are going to be imposed because they exist in reality because of legislation, and they have also been somehow transformed in some ways positively, in other ways negatively. And then I believe that that's an essential area for us to look at if we want to discuss how these then movements materialize, because they're emerging as the existing representation system did not allow for these voices to be represented. They appear, they challenge the order, but then how then exactly, as Raghu was describing, some are going to enter the political parties, some are going to create some new parties emerge, but then they're going to then play by rules that some pre-existed and some had some problems in terms of restrictions, and then it will take time for that to stabilize. And we do have an issue here, I would say, on how, let's say, the speed of digital communications and how that enables, in a sense, some sort of quick mobilization that then for that to be materialized into kind of organic association, there is a process there, and there will be, of course, the actors that are hostile to these movements are going to somehow try to disrupt at that transition. So I think it's an essential point to look at how these movements then unfold, and support this transition is going to be key to increase chances that they are really transformative from a democratic perspective. Sorry.
Great, thanks a lot. Really interesting discussion we had, and I think one key point that came out for me was this question of sustainability of those movements, and how do we support or make sure that the push for, might be for economic, social, cultural rights or other allegations of wrongs that are exposed to these movements are actually then tackled, and those movements are not just in a way co-opted into the mainstream, and then things keep on going in the same way. So I think this is really a challenge because also the cycles, as Raghu was mentioning, of the 10-year, every 10 years you have a protest movement. It's kind of indicative of this challenge potentially, that you kind of have the same problems that are never, what we call the root causes, are never addressed and are never actually tackled. So we are going to close it now, but I also just wanted to mention there was one comment in the chat from Melanie, which we haven't touched upon, which was on South Korea and the concept of solidarity beyond presence. So there was a use of technology of supporting the movement without actually being in the movement. And I think this is an aspect I just wanted to mention at the end, where it's interesting to think about how this could in future maybe evolve further and might be a new way of supporting specific movements. But beyond that, it's just thank you very much, and Raghu specifically, for taking this up within 2 hours. Great to have this panel, and let's see this as a start of a larger discussion for our office on this and for our team with this specifically. We are very interested to hear more, and stay in touch if you can. And thank you very much. We'll leave it there. Have a good rest of the day or night. Take care.
Thanks, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.